Hi everyone, welcome to episode 8 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they used to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. In this episode, I interviewed James Cattermole, a serial enterprise software entrepreneur who has 2 successful exits under his belt and is now onto his 3rd business, as well as being an active angel investor in early-stage enterprise startups. During the interview, James shares a complete playbook in how to launch and grow enterprise companies, covering topics including how to transition from corporate life into startups, how to find and spot good ideas, how to action feedback into pivots, the one question you need to be able to answer clients, the challenges of expanding overseas, what startups should look for in investors, and the one caveat where giving your software away for free makes total sense. Without further ado, here is my interview with James Cattermole. Hi James, welcome to the Startup Playbook Podcast.
Thanks for having me, mate. Nice to be here.
No, not a problem. So, for those people that aren't too familiar with your background, can you give a little bit of a story of how you got started and where you are now?
Sure. Most people won't have heard of me. I kind of keep a low profile. I'm a technology entrepreneur in software. I focus almost exclusively on enterprise, is where my background's always been. I started off as an employee in a software company, and I have an engineering background, a master's in engineering, and I actually went and lived overseas in England for a couple of years. Did that, as a lot of Aussies do, and that was kind of really the motivation for me to start my own thing. And interestingly, it was actually because the company that I was working for over in England, while I enjoyed the company, I really didn't like the management very much. And I sort of realised that the only way I was ever going to be in control of who my boss was if it was my company. So when I returned back from England, that's when I sort of founded my own company.
Sure. So how did you kind of take that leap from working for someone else, recognising that you wanted to do that? Because I assume there are a couple of listeners here who are in the corporate space at the moment that do have an idea or want to get out of it. What instigated that change for you?
Sure. Mine was probably a bit of an odd scenario compared to most, in that I was actually brought in to do, I guess, what you'd call some management consulting on this particular software company. This guy had this idea and he wanted some sort of strategic advice, and I'd come from that sort of consulting background. And I took one look at what he was doing and said, well, actually, I think this could be done better. And so what I brokered was a deal with him where he sort of got to walk away and take some cash off the table, and I basically took over the business, is how it worked. It was only very infantile at that stage, but that's kind of how it happened. To your question about, if somebody's thinking about getting into entrepreneurism, if you're in a company and you've got a good solid job, look, it is scary and it can be intimidating, and you're wondering, what if I get this wrong? What if it doesn't happen? But I think one of the things that I sort of mentor some guys on is you don't have all that much to lose. And what I mean by that is, if you're an eminently employable person and you're in a good job and you're working for a big company, those jobs will still be there. So you can go and have a crack at your own thing for a year or 2 years or 5 years, and the big companies offering those jobs will still be there. And unless you make yourself unemployable somehow, there's a good chance that you'll have a fallback position to get a job. So I tend to look at these things as what's the worst that could happen, and then sort of dial it back from there, I guess.
Sure. I mean, that experience and the exposure that you would get to so many more things makes you even more employable to those same corporates. And like you said, those same opportunities will always be there. So in terms of the businesses that you started, you've had 2 successful exits to date. Can you talk a little bit about how those, again, what those companies were, how they started, and what led to the exit of both companies?
Sure. The first one was called VNH Systems, and it was entertainment software, basically. We did DVD rental technology back when that technology existed. We built that up and we licensed the software to companies around the world, and then I exited that to Blockbuster, again back when they were sort of a market player. Then sort of immediately following that, I had the second business, which was a company called JadeLynx, and that was a services and consulting business, and I sold that to DWS, which is a listed software services company here in Australia.
Sure. So I guess between those two companies, you said that you jumped from one to the other after immediately selling something. Was it that you saw an opportunity that you immediately felt that you had to jump into straight away, or was it, what kind of, again, led to that shorter time frame between you kind of running two companies?
And I don't know, but I assume I'm probably a little different from others that have gone through this journey, in that I didn't have any downtime between them. It literally was one and then the next day straight into the other. A big part of it, from my perspective, is that I had the opportunity to retain some really good people. As part of the negotiation of exiting both those companies, I had the option to pick and choose certain key individuals that I wanted to keep. And in anything, finding good people is really hard to do. And so when you have an opportunity to retain them, if you think you've got something you can use them for, then my view is you probably should try. So what I ended up with was a really good group of resources that I could put to use straight away. So that's how, from the first business to the second business, we almost sort of by accident ended up being a services consulting firm, because I had all these really skilled resources that I knew people would want to pay money to utilise. So that's kind of how it came about.
Sure. And with the two companies that ended up selling, JadeLynx and VNH Systems, did you start those businesses, or at any point be in the mindset of wanting to exit those companies, or how did the sale come about? Did people come and approach you, or were you sort of actively looking to build it and position the company in a way that it would be attractive to people to buy?
Look, my view is that I don't think you should ever be building a company deliberately to sell it. And if you're starting a business thinking, I'm going to sell this to X in 2 years' time, I think that's probably a really dangerous proposition. The reason for that is that running a really successful business should be your goal, not trying to position yourself for an exit. If you run a really successful business that gets great revenues or big user base or great social media exposure, or whatever it is that your metrics are, the acquirers will come to you, I think is probably the lesson that I would learn. And that's kind of what happened in our case. There was, obviously you have to be willing to have the conversations with an acquirer. But I think as an entrepreneur, my view is that everything's for sale every minute of any day, as long as it's for the right price and under the right conditions. But I think you want to be in a position where the acquirers are knocking on your door, you're not knocking on their door, because then it is the difference between being acquired and actually versus selling your company. And the end results and the money and the conditions and all that kind of stuff that go with that exit will be very different if you are being acquired as opposed to proactively selling. So I think you can have in the back of your mind, if you're an entrepreneur, about who a likely acquirer could be, and maybe position yourselves to be complementary to them. But I think that's a very different attitude to building something from scratch to be acquired deliberately.
Sure. So when you got your sort of offers especially for VNH Systems, which was your first company, was there any hesitancy on your end, or was there any sort of obviously you've put in a couple of years of hard work and effort to build the company up to where it was? Was it difficult to make that decision to sell at any point?
No, it really wasn't, particularly with the first business, and that was because we had already recognised that the window of opportunity around DVD technology was starting to close. So we knew we were going to have to do something within the next few years, pretty dramatically changing the business anyway. So when an opportunity presented itself, it was a pretty easy decision to make. Now, that being said, any entrepreneur, you put your blood, sweat and tears into whatever it is you do. So there's always some heartstrings to pull at. But in that particular scenario, no, we'd actually already considered changing or morphing or altering the business anyway. So when the opportunity came to exit, it was kind of a no-brainer.
Sure. So obviously you're now onto your third startup. How do you? I'm really interested to hear how you find opportunities and how you kind of filter them through. Do you have a lot of different ideas that you have and you kind of pick the best one? Is it something that you just immediately find and spot and you jump into that straight away? What does that process look like for you?
I don't really have a process per se. I think I just kind of fall down a rabbit hole and see where it ends up. I mean, for me, and I think most entrepreneurs have this, there's always ideas. There's at any minute of the day, I've got 10 things in my head that you could do next, or this would be a great idea, what have you. And so I think for me, it's more about filtering out the opportunities rather than the opposite way around. And for me, the process is really around, okay, you've got this idea and that's cool, great, but what could you do with it? As in, what can I do with it? Where are my core skills? And how can I turn this idea into something that's great off the back of what I can deliver? So what I mean by that is, as I mentioned before, I'm an enterprise software guy. So I could have a great idea on some consumer product, but I recognize that that's not going to be my skill set. And even if it's a great idea and a great concept, I'm going to have a very limited skill set to really take that to market and drive it. So that's a filter that I can immediately apply and say, okay, this probably isn't for you. And once you start doing that, they start whittling down very quickly. And then, you have to be in a position to actually execute on something. So if you're neck deep, as I am right now with my new startup, I couldn't take on anything new right now because then you'd be shortchanging one or the other. And then you've got to do, all the standard due diligence and market research about whether the idea is something that's actually viable or not. So as you apply these criteria and focus on where your life position is relative to starting something new, I think most of these things flesh themselves out pretty clearly.
Sure. So it's almost about kind of being self-aware of your own strengths and realizing what it is that you can actually execute on and doubling down on those particular areas.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it.
Sure. So you mentioned your new startup. Can you tell us a little bit about Hexigo?
Sure. Well, what we do with Hexigo is it's an email task management system. And what we focus on the fact is that email, particularly in the corporate sense, is this beast that you cannot escape. Everybody kind of has this love-hate relationship with their email. And one of the reasons we believe that email is so time-consuming in people's days is that we all use it for stuff that's not really meant to be used for, but we just do because we're all inherently lazy and we live in our inbox. An example of that kind of bad behavior, if you like, that consumes time would be things like most people use their inbox as a to-do list. They keep the email in their inbox until they're ready to action it. And that's, really inefficient because it means your inbox is always full. It's always bursting. And another behavior that is inefficient is things like task allocation. There's all these great task management systems out there and no one uses them, apart from engineering teams and development teams. Everybody else just sends an email saying, James, I need you to do X. Well, that's task management, task allocation. But again, email is really poor for that kind of functionality. So we've built a system in Hexigo that plugs directly into your existing email. So that's Gmail or Outlook from Microsoft, to extend or augment the functionality that your native email has to cover off some of these bad behaviors with a view to make it your inbox much more productive. And so far the response, it's only early days, but the response has been really, really positive, which is great.
Great. So if people want to check out Hexigo, what's the link?
It's just hexigo.com, hexigo.com.
Perfect. I'll make sure that goes into the show notes. But I guess something that we talked about last time we caught up, which was a couple of months ago, was the concept of what Hexigo is now wasn't what you started off with. Again, can you kind of talk a little bit about what the initial concept was and how and why you've changed and pivoted to the focus that you've got now?
So the initial concept was around decision management. Again, my background being working with big corporates, we found that working with big corporates is really frustrating because getting decisions made is really quite a painful process in these large organisations. So we built initially quite a sophisticated cloud product that tracked and managed decisions within large organisations. We got that to market. We onboarded some early stage customers. The response we got was very consistent, which was, look, we love the concept of what this does because we need help making decisions, but could you please put this functionality inside email? Because trying to get people out of email to log into another system is really difficult to do. And so, in I guess what you'd call typical startup fashion, we listened to the feedback that we were getting from our customers and we pivoted accordingly to be in that email direction. And then once we'd embedded the decision-making capability into email, we tracked and watched the functionality that people were using. And what became very evident was particularly around tasking and calling people out to do an action or do a task, usually relating to a decision, was what people really liked and really used. So that was how we ended up being, I guess, a more task-oriented system than initially we started it.
Sure. I mean, it's something that I've seen a lot, especially in the startup space, is people get very heavily focused on the product that they're creating and the how useful it will be to everyone once they jump on, without necessarily realizing how consumers are actually using particular services. And the fact that you've kind of listened to your customers and tapped into the way that they're already using their emails rather than trying to jump them off and move them on to something else is really interesting. So what sort of stage is the company at the moment?
We're live. We're in full production now, and we've got some large organisations starting on board. We've just, fingers crossed, I can't give you the name, but we are hopefully just about to sign a deal with one of the world's biggest consulting firms to deploy on a site license, enterprise license. So that's pretty exciting for us. So yeah, we're in market and live, and we're working with some very big companies, and so far the response has been extremely positive.
Fantastic. And again, there's probably some listeners who are in the B2B space or have an early stage startup that is looking to get into the software enterprise space. How do you specifically approach clients, approach organizations that will potentially use your service?
Yeah, and this is, and you talked about your strengths and weaknesses and recognizing them, and this is a key area I think people need to recognize. Selling to an enterprise is a particular skill set, and it is different from selling to an SME, and it's different again from selling to a consumer. It really is its own skill set, and in terms of approaching enterprise, you've got to be aware of the mentality of the companies that you're working with. And in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, they're very conservative. People aren't really willing to take a lot of risk in an organization, particularly in a big corporation. They want change and they want things to improve, but they don't necessarily want to stick their neck out in order to be the one to make that happen, because there is a fear, rightly or wrongly, that if they do stick their neck out, it could get chopped off. So when you work with enterprise, you've got to realize that, number one, the pace will be slow, particularly again compared to a consumer or an SME. What speed that a corporation makes a decision at and implements something is literally months or years, and you've got to be patient. And you've got to work the politics, and you've got to know who the players are within an organisation to massage through the process. And these are all the things that you need to do in order to get to a successful endpoint. And that will be IT security reviews, it will be working through with legal, it'll be working with procurement, it'll be making sure that you have a senior enough executive to champion what you're doing. So over the course of the weeks and the months and potentially the years that you work on a sale, you have to map all of these right people to your end goal in order to get there. And that is something that it is quite a skill set and takes a lot of time and patience.
Sure. So again, for someone who's starting out, how do they foster those relationships, or what for you is the first point of contact or the first meeting? What is your aim or your goal out of the first meeting that you have with a new person at a company?
Sure. What I typically do is start with my network. And in most cases, and again, the power of LinkedIn and all these kind of things, you'll know someone who knows someone at that company. So if you want to get into, I'm just picking this example, here in Australia, if you want to get into Telstra, there's probably a good chance that you'll know someone through a secondary connection who works at Telstra. And what you want to do is get an introduction to that person and sit down and buy them a cup of coffee and and literally just pick their brain about the politics of the place, and getting an understanding of what you're going to need to do in order to progress your sales process. And you're going to have lots of cups of coffee with lots of people in a company the size of Telstra in order to identify who the key players are that you need to meet. And this is a big part of the time that it takes, is slowly building up to meeting that right person. If you're really lucky, you might know that person, or somebody, your brother might know that person from day one. Awesome. Most of the time, that's not going to be the case. It is literally, you have to collect the pieces of the puzzle, which are with the different people that you meet, and start building the picture about who are the people and what are the processes that we need to go through. And that really just means networking and shaking hands and having cups of coffee and taking lots and lots of notes.
Sure. So for a startup with, again, focusing on the very early stage, for startups with limited resources, they only have a runway for a certain amount of time, and they can only be patient to a certain degree as well. Is there any way to not speed up the process, but identify early on whether it's going to be a right fit with a specific company? And
you're absolutely right, and that's why enterprise is very difficult and a different challenge than consumer or corporate, because of the time and the finite resources that you do have as an early startup. The reason you see so many enterprise software companies start from people who've been in that world. So often you'll see them take, again, just purely as an example, the Telstra thing. Someone spins out of Telstra with an idea of something that Telstra would want themselves, and then they go and build that product. That is how so often you can speed this up, because you know what the inner workings of that organisation are. That's going to be the most rapid way to speed up the process. You can't really force the process though. If you're a complete outsider and you come knocking on the door of some big corporation, it's going to be extremely difficult to get them to work on your timescale. They will have their own timescale, and trying to get them to change is going to be an exceedingly difficult thing to do. So my advice would be to, if you are starting out from scratch and you've got very limited resources, think very carefully about the nature of the company and the nature of the person within that company who you are selling to. How accessible is that person, or are those people? If your buyer is the CFO or the COO or the CEO, you better be prepared for a very long sales cycle, because just getting to that person is going to take months. Whereas if your buyer is a much more lower down the totem pole type person, it's going to be easier. And there's examples of both of those. So Yammer was a great example in the enterprise space a few years ago. They deliberately went after the millennials and the younger generation and the I guess what you call the lower rungs of an organisation, and grew from the ground up. It was easy to get to those people. Whereas other companies really do need that very high-level executive buy-in and push from the top down. Different sales cycles, different approaches. My advice to someone starting from scratch with very finite resources is think very carefully about how you can adapt your sales process to make it faster to get to the people you need to get to.
Sure. So once you've got a lay of the land and you've built those relationships, what does the next step look like? And can you share any specific strategies that you use to help drive those sales internally?
Sure. The number one thing you want to find within an organisation is pain, and that sounds quite cliched, but it's true. You want to find the things that companies proactively want to fix. We know we have a problem with X, right? What companies are really bad at is, what is the solution for that problem? So if you can take the solution to them, all of a sudden you can be on a very rapid sales cycle. If they have a genuine problem and they've been thinking about fixing it for a long time and haven't been able to identify a fix, or just haven't got off their backsides and done anything about it, if you take that solution to them, you can really get things moving quickly. And so coming back to the question about how do you work on this, it's about identifying the pain and who has the pain, and does the need to fix this pain have a commercial benefit? And that's really what it boils down to. And this is the difference between consumer and corporate. Consumers can do things on a whim, because it's their own money or and their own motivation. Corporations, particularly if you're looking at deployment on any kind of scale, they need justification, because at some point you're going to hit someone from legal or procurement or finance that says, why are we doing this, and how much money is this going to cost us relative to how much money it's going to save us? And so what you want to be able to identify very quickly is the pain that they're feeling has a financial impact, whether that's directly cost or whether it's time, efficiency, whatever it is, and then you can be able to answer that question when it is asked, and it will get asked eventually. If it's not day one, it'll be later on when you want to scale to thousands of users. Someone's going to say, why are we buying this? And that's when you need to have your answer.
Sure. So one of the things that I guess this is coming down to with enterprise sales especially is the amount of resources that you need and the patience that you need to go through that process. What does a strong team look like to you to help to execute on an enterprise software idea? So I mean, if you're one person or a two-man show, you can't do everything by yourself. What do you think is the minimum or the main skill sets that you need?
Look, I think we need to separate this out into a couple of areas. Let's answer this from a sales perspective, because the assumption is that you have an engineering team or engineers working on the product or the service, whatever it is. They're going to do what they do. They don't need to be involved necessarily in the sort of the sales process. From a sales process perspective, I don't think you need any more than one person. You just need one person that has the attention to detail and the patience to see it through. And the biggest thing that one person needs to be able to do quite quickly in the piece is identify, is this a genuine opportunity, or am I just chasing a whale or a brand for the sake of doing it? And that's a very dangerous thing that I've seen a lot. People really want to sign a BHP or a Qantas or a Telstra or a Microsoft because they think that those logos are so appealing, and it's a real trophy to get. But chasing logos can be very, very dangerous, because you can sink so much time into an opportunity that isn't real, because you're blinded by the fact that you really want to land Google, that there actually isn't much of an opportunity there. So you may only need one person. That person just has to be diligent. They have to be really honest with how realistic is this opportunity, what are the time scales to bring this opportunity into fruition, compared to these other opportunities that we have. There are a lot of companies out there that make great sales and great amount of money selling into organizations you've never heard of. And those organizations can all actually be quite appealing. Because no one's ever heard of them, there's less competition to get in there. Everybody's trying to sell to BHP and Qantas and Google, but there's lots of companies that no one's selling to. So in terms of the manpower, I don't think that's necessarily the issue per se. It's not like you need an army in order to tackle. You just need the right people to have the right mentality and to be really brutally honest about how likely are we to be successful with this particular opportunity.
Sure. And so touching on that and expanding your initial team out. So Hexigo at the moment, you're based in, is it San Fran? And Melbourne?
Palo Alto.
Palo Alto.
Yeah.
And Melbourne. When do you decide to expand or have a second office in a different country? Again, what kind of instigates that?
Yeah. Let me answer that question. But I didn't obey any of my own rules when we expanded to America. So put that aside. If I was sort of to advise someone on when to do it, the one thing I would say is that the big benefit that we have about living in Australia particularly if you look at the US being the world's biggest market, which is where most organisations plan to expand into. The real benefit of being in Australia is we are such a similar cultural fit. Particularly the west coast of the US and Australia is very similar sort of psychology and cultural fit. What that allows you to do is really prove out what you're doing here in Australia first. While the Australian market is much smaller and has limited opportunities, it is a very similar fit to America, so you can ensure that what you're doing actually works before you expand into America. Because whatever you're doing, if it works really well in Australia, there's a pretty good chance it'll work well in America. That's something that we have been here that other countries don't have. You know, if you lived in India or Germany or other places where the cultural alignment to America isn't as strong, there's less proof points that what you're doing will work there. So my advice to somebody who's looking to expand into America is honestly, don't be in such a rush. I know it's really appealing, and you want to get over there, and you've heard so much about it, and it seems great, and all of those things can be true. But at the same time, the minute you split your resources across different locations, particularly across different countries, you're tackling a whole different beast. And you want to make sure that you're as ready as you can be to do that. So my advice to Australians is don't be overly conservative, and don't say, right, we're not expanding for 5 years. But at the same time, make sure that what you're doing works here before you consider moving over there. Because I think in the bulk of cases, if it doesn't work here, there's a strong chance that it won't work there.
Sure. And again, you kind of just touched on this point. But what are some of the main challenges that you have in having and splitting up resources that people may not necessarily think about?
Yeah, we identified sort of three main categories, if you want to call it that, of challenge around splitting, particularly across countries. The first is cultural. And anyone that's worked in a large organisation, there's cultural changes from city to city, from building to building, let alone completely different parts of the world. So you're going to have to manage the culture that you have across your different locations. And that can be really tricky to do because not only in different locations, but you're probably taking people from an inherently completely different backgrounds. If you're, and I'm just using an example, if you're expanding to America, chances are you're going to be employing Americans as opposed to Australians. So you've got to manage the culture to try and get as much alignment across the two as you can. And big corporations spend millions of dollars a year and have HR departments, all this kind of stuff, to try and get a similar alignment culturally across their various offices as they can. In a startup, it's you don't have all those resources to spend there, but you've got to really put the effort in to make sure that you're hiring the right people on both sides or in your different locations, because you want to keep that consistency of culture. The second area that we had, so first was culture, the second area that we identified was operational. The minute you split your resources, not only are you spreading yourselves thin operationally, but you've got a lot more stuff to manage. Simple things like time zones and being able to get people to communicate properly and that kind of stuff. Everyone sort of thought about those kind of things. But there's a lot of operational issues that I discovered when we did it, that hadn't even considered. And things would be like legislative difference. So an example would be in Australia, we have very specific employment laws. Everyone gets 4 weeks leave a year and you get paid superannuation and all this kind of stuff. In America, that basically doesn't exist. And it changes by state. So in California, in Silicon Valley, for example, you really have the opportunity to make up your own employment rules. How much leave people have, whether they get paid super or what's called a 401k over there. In Australia, it can be quite difficult to fire somebody, to terminate somebody. You have a management process that you have to go through. In America, for all intents and purposes, you can walk in tomorrow and fire half your company if you want to. So those kind of changes really do affect the way you operate your business and the way that you manage people in different locations. Because A, you've got those cultural differences that I mentioned before, but B, you've now got legislative differences that you need to be very mindful of. And that was something that we sort of didn't, I must admit, when we expanded, hadn't even thought of. until we got there, the notion that their employment laws would be completely different, and we therefore have to have a different mentality and operational behaviour to meet those laws. And then the third thing, in terms of the third category of challenge you have when you're splitting across locations, is around the product itself or the service that you have. The minute you start taking on different geographies, you'll have different priorities about what the users and the customers want that product to do. And we talked before about, let's say, Australia and the West Coast of America are quite similarly aligned. But let's say you're expanding into a completely different area. If you're expanding into India or China or whatever, what the product does and how the end user uses that product could be very, very different. And you now have really conflicting priorities around what are we going to do with the product, where are we going to apply the resource, how are we going to develop the strategic direction from Australia to your other location. So again, that's something that I think a lot of people don't think about, is that here in Australia with our Australian customers, they want us to develop this particular feature. That's the feedback that we're getting. But over in China, where we've expanded into, we're getting a completely different set of feedback on features. Which one are we going to put first? We've only got finite resources. So those are sort of the three challenges that we really came across, which was around culture, it was around operational limitations and the things you need to be aware of operating in different countries, and then the product and how do we apply our resource to meet the different needs in the different geographies that you're in.
Sure. Is there anything specifically that you do to manage or make those decisions on the product?
The short answer is that's really tough. I don't have a golden rule. I wish I did. That'd make life a lot easier. But what we try and do is I say, what is going to be the most likely, greatest impact to the greatest number of users? Is his best sort of guess that you can possibly have. In an enterprise space where we are, if you have one particular customer that is your Goliath, and they are saying, we need the product to do this particular thing, you probably really need to listen to that. You have to be careful because you don't want to end up having different versions of a product for different organizations and for different users. But at the same time, you do need to be mindful of who's paying the actual bills and who's giving you revenue. So that's a long-winded answer to your question to say, no, I don't have a specific methodology that we've used. It really is kind of identify each feature or opportunity that presents itself and try and make a best guess decision, really.
Sure. And just finally, what are your thoughts on offering software for free to bring companies on? I know we've touched on this before, but keen to the listeners to get your thoughts on this.
The short answer is I am all for giving software away for free with a but. And it's a pretty big caveat that I say on that. Again, and I want to stress, I'm coming at this from an enterprise perspective. I'm not equipped to comment on whether giving it away to consumers is a good thing. In the enterprise space, you can get very caught up with how many people are using your product. But if they aren't generating revenue and there isn't a pathway to turn it into revenue, then they're really hollow metrics. You can say, yay, we've got 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 users using this thing. Great. How many of those are paying for it? Because unlike in a consumer world where you might be able to sell advertising or something like that, you really can't do that in a corporate world. So you have to be sure that giving it away for free will ultimately lead to revenue generation. And that's not only true in terms of the survival of your company right now, you need dollars coming in the door, but also from an exit perspective. Again, in the consumer world, companies will be acquired just for having a huge user base. In an enterprise world, that's extremely unlikely, unless you can show your potential acquirer how you're going to turn that into actual dollars, because that's what they care about. They want to be able to see a clear pathway. Even if you're not doing it today, you want to have a very, very clear pathway of how you are going to monetize this. So I think, getting a momentum within an organization, getting the snowball rolling down the hill and picking up users by giving it away for free can work, but it is a temporary solution. And as long as you recognize that it is a temporary solution and that you have a clear path to move into revenue generation, that's really going to be the focus that I think you need to work on. The other thing that you need to be mindful of is, I don't necessarily believe people value what you give them for free. And that's another psychological thing within a corporation, is if someone isn't willing to pay for your service, then how much is it really worth to them? You know, if they're not willing to pay you $1 for it, if you turned it off tomorrow, would they really care? And the answer is probably not. So the really great companies that make really great money have done so because their product is so valuable that turning it off would create a huge amount of pain. And you look at companies like Salesforce or Microsoft and these kind of organizations that if you turn around tomorrow and say, right, no one has Word or Excel, most companies would fall apart. If you turn around and said, right, none of the sales and marketing team has any access to any of their customer information on Salesforce, again, the company would fall apart. So that's why these companies can charge the money that they do, because their product has value. You can't be sure that you're generating real value unless you're forcing people to pay for it. That's going to be the acid test about whether people really use this, really value it, and really need it in their day-to-day lives. Because if they don't, they won't pay for it. And that, I think, is, again, another reason why you really need to have a plan to drive people to pay for something. You might start with a free trial to get the ball rolling, but you quite quickly need to get them onto paying for it, because if nothing else, it then validates that this is something they actually do need or want on a daily basis.
Sure. And just quickly, you've recently got into angel investing.
Well. Not so much recently, but yes, I've been doing it a little while.
So relatively recently, considering your career. What areas do you play in terms of angel investing, and what is it that you look for in founders, considering your background as a serial entrepreneur?
Sure. In terms of what I invest in, again, it's exclusively enterprise stuff, and that's because that's something I know, it's something that I'm comfortable with, and it's something that potentially I can add value to the founders and the organisation. I think, anyone that invests in an organisation, that the founders should really be considering, does this person add value beyond the money? And if they don't, work very hard to not take their money. So my view is, if I'm going to invest in something or be part of an investment into something, it should be something that I can add some kind of guidance or value in some way. So that's why I'm an enterprise guy. In terms of what I'm looking for, the number one thing, and this is incredibly difficult to do, by the way, and I think it's probably the biggest challenge for any startup. The number one thing to me that really makes a business attractive and highly investable is if they know who their buyer is, really specifically. And that's something that as a startup is very difficult to do, is to move from being vague around who your buyer is to being very specific about who your buyer is. We sell to enterprise companies with 1,000 users. That's really vague. What I want to hear is, we sell to enterprise companies that have between 1,000 users and 3,000 users, who are in the construction industry, based in North America, and build skyscrapers, but don't build homes. And we target the marketing manager. Bingo. That is something that immediately is appealing to me, because they now have a target that they can work towards, and you can build the whole business around that target. Often, though, in an early stage company, you don't know yet who your specific buyer is. But what I am looking for is acknowledgement of that we know we need to find the right buyer, a pretty decent understanding of who that is, and in particular, what's really appealing is if one of the founders or part of the team was that person, because they then know the pain, and that's how often really great products are built, because it was someone that worked in one of these companies that said, what we really need is a system that does X, and then they went, I'm going to build it myself. that's a really strong proof point that there is a need in the market. The counterpoint to that is what I'm wary of is someone that's trying to sell into a market in order that they have no exposure to or no genuine experience in. Take that very bad example I gave you of the construction industry. I would be very hesitant in investing in something, if you're trying to sell software in the construction industry, if no one in the team has come from that background. Because how have you validated the assumption that people need this product that you're building? So those are the kind of things that I'm looking for. There's always variance in that, but I'm really looking for someone who can demonstrate that they genuinely are convinced that there is a need in the market for this particular solution. And the more specific about who needs it, the better.
Sure. So on the flip side, is there anything that you look for in a team or in a founder? So what comes first? So is it initially the problem and the potential product that they're creating that gets you interested in the product, and then it's the team that sells you, or is it a combination of the two, or are there other factors as well?
It's definitely going to be a combination of the two. I think as an early stage investor like I am, you're really looking for a solution to a specific problem, or at least I am. I know VCs and institutional VCs who they are always looking for a team they can match, but that's because a really good team can pivot, and they can change and adapt, and a really good team can do that. The issue with that, though, is it takes time, and that takes money and takes resource. And as an early stage investor, that's not what I'm interested in. I'm looking for as a specific solution to as specific a problem as we can get. Often, it's not that specific, but if you can give me an indication that will be, then I'm more interested. And then the more experienced you are and your team is, you don't necessarily have to be a founder to be a key member of the team, by the way, then obviously that's more appealing. If you've got two 18-year-olds that have literally just finished high school and they've got some product that they think will sell into a KPMG and a Qantas, I'm going to be very wary of that because they simply don't know. Whereas if you've got one guy that worked at KPMG and one guy that worked at Qantas for 20 years and they're telling me that this problem needs to be fixed, suddenly I'm much more interested.
Sure. I think we are out of time. So for anyone that wants to get in touch with you, find out more about you or kind of follow you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Oh God, I'm terrible on social media, guys. I do have a Twitter account. I don't even know what my Twitter handle is. Just do search for James Cattermole, and I'm on LinkedIn as well as James Cattermole. That's not my strength. But happy to talk and have coffee. If I can add value to people.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much for that, James. I think that was extremely insightful. So thanks for coming in, and really looking forward to keeping up to date with how Hexigo is going as well.
Pleasure, mate.
Thanks for listening to episode 8 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with James, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Next week, I interview Angus McCulloch, a growth and marketing expert who has amassed a following of over 1.6 million followers across 5 different accounts on Instagram. In the interview, Angus deconstructs the Instagram algorithm to show you how to get your account trending. He provides specific strategies to help you grow your follower base, including why you should upload multiple posts within a specific time period, and shares his thoughts on how startups can leverage Instagram to increase revenue for their business. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 9 next week.